Good evening, one and all, and welcome to today's compilation video. We're lucky enough to be joined by the Phenomenal Paranormal Scholar and the sensational Cayleigh Elise. You're certainly in for a treat, so get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Number 1.
This story is one that has been passed down to me from my late grandfather. The circumstances are so unusual, so unlike anything I have ever heard, that it's been in the back of my mind for nearly 20 years, ever since it was first told to me when I was a child. My grandfather was a great talker and storyteller in his own way, and my family agrees that he wouldn't mind if I shared it with others. The look on my grandfather's face every time he told this story, well, you could tell that it shook him up. First, I'll need to give you a little background. My grandfather was born in the early 20s in a dirt-floor, 2-room farmhouse in rural South Carolina, an only child of sharecroppers during the Great Depression. He was a premature baby, and his parents, already having lost one infant, were understandably protective of him. I'm sure they were relieved and very happy that he was a strong and healthy child, albeit with an incredible amount of wanderlust. Restless and energetic, he almost always finished his chores as quickly as he could, so that he could take up his little fishing rod and roam to his heart's content. Back then, even horse-drawn carts were a rarity on those long-gone dirt roads. Cars were practically unheard of in that part of the country in those days. Disliking horses, but still greatly desiring to put as much distance between home and himself as he could in the span of an afternoon, my grandfather had little choice other than to walk. And walk he did. He combed through many miles of woods, fields and swampland, barefoot as the day he came into this world, heedless of brambles or snakes. They wouldn't bother him if he didn't bother them. As much as he enjoyed it, it was a lonely business. His father, with acres of land to tend to as well as livestock, hardly had the time to join his son on these walks. Sometimes one of the local boys would go with him, but that wasn't often. So, being practically kin to everyone within a 30-mile radius, my grandfather took up the grand old southern tradition of going visiting. One of his favourite places to go was to Uncle Peter's. Uncle Peter lived on one of those branches of the lake that stretched across a good portion of the county. It was a tiny shack, hardly more than a shanty, and barely big enough to fit both him and his spinster sister Henrietta, but they made do. Now, Uncle Peter loved to talk about as much as he loved to fish, so when he would spot my grandfather coming up the dirt track towards the house, he'd put whatever he was working on aside. Aunt Henrietta was prone to give him the stink eye for this, but she was fond of my grandfather too, so she never said anything. It became a tradition of sorts for my grandfather to put a spare shirt in a sack, along with a treat of some kind that his mother made, and head off for Uncle Peter's every other weekend. He did this for years, right up until he married my grandmother. Usually, it was about dark when he'd set off, meaning it was well after sunset before he got there, the distance between his house and Uncle Peter's being in the reckoning of about 6 or 7 miles. Grandfather tended to stay through Sunday, heading home after evening supper, which tended to be on the table well after dark. Suffice to say, there wasn't much to be afraid of back then other than the local wildlife, and as I said before, as long as you minded your own business, they minded theirs. He'd been walking through the countryside at night all his life. He was comfortable and felt very safe. As had become habit throughout the years, Grandfather kissed Aunt Henrietta goodbye, shook Uncle Peter's hand, and started home at a brisk pace. It was autumn, so the air was pleasantly cool, a welcome relief from summer's oppressively humid heat. He said that there was a full moon that night, and when he could walk out in the open, it was fairly well lit. He could easily see where he was going. The dirt track that led away from Uncle Peter's shack meandered through a bit of marshland before it ended at the wider road. Usually he didn't take that route unless he felt like a bit of a wander, since cutting through the fields and woodland was a straighter shot back to his parents' farmhouse, and the road slithered and slunk its way around the far side of the lake before curving back in the direction of home. That night, however, with the moonlight and the refreshing nip in the wind, Grandfather felt the urge to do a bit of meandering. Turning at the end of the path, he stepped onto the road, barefoot as a jaybird and softly whistling to himself. The route was so familiar that he hardly paid any attention to the surroundings, letting his feet do most of the work while he occupied himself with other thoughts. Before he knew it, he was approaching the lake. The water was calm that night, dark and still. He slowed down a little, wanting to watch the way the light rippled and shimmered gently. It was such a pretty sight that he nearly missed what was standing not far up the road. At first, it was just a silhouette, a tall and solid-looking shadow that seemed to be facing the water. Grandfather thought it might have been a trick of the light initially. After all, he had walked through a cemetery once in the middle of the night and thought he'd seen a soldier riding a white horse until he'd gotten closer and realized it was just a large dewdrop spiderweb. Yet, as he drew nearer, he realized it wasn't his eyes. There was something standing on the side of the road. In fact, it was a man. He could tell by the build, broad-shouldered and narrow at the hip. And he could tell by the clothes. Even in the moonlight, it was evident that the man wore a dark suit that did not fit him well. A shapeless hat was on his head, causing his form to appear elongated and odd-looking. From the distance of several feet, Grandfather could see the shine of good shoes, polished until they picked up the water's gleam. The man was standing close to the water, so close in fact that the waves were lapping at those expensive-looking shoes. The lake's shifting reflection softly illuminated his face, and Grandfather could make out strong features that had been weathered with time and toil. The lines around his mouth and eyes were distinctive as he smiled. That was when Grandfather realized that the man was smiling at him. In fact, the man had been staring at him just as long, or longer, as Grandfather had been doing the same. Quickly remembering his manners, he greeted the man politely. The man's expression didn't change, as his head turned to follow my grandfather's movement until he stopped on the other side of the road. A little unnerved, my grandfather stood awkwardly for a long moment, waiting for what he thought would be the appropriate amount of time for a reply. The man didn't speak. His face never changed, but he slowly brought his hand up and made a beckoning motion with his fingers, silently asking my grandfather to come closer. Grandfather shook his head. "No, sir, I can't stay and talk. I have to get home. You have a nice night." Dipping his head, my grandfather started walking again, passing the strange man with a slightly quicker pace than he'd been walking before. Feeling that he was being watched, he stopped again a little further up the road. He turned to look back to see the man had turned around so that he was facing the direction of my grandfather, still staring at him, but now he was waist deep in the water. Confused and shocked, Grandfather could only gape at the man as he stood in the lake, that same grin on his face as he lifted his hand and beckoned again. Shaking his head quickly, my grandfather repeated what he'd said before, the words out of his mouth before he could think about how weird they sounded now. "No, sir, I can't stay and talk. I have to get home. You have a nice night." He whipped around and started walking even faster up the road, listening for the sound of splashing or footsteps behind him. But there was nothing. And that was when it struck him. He had never heard a sound. No splash, no drip, no scuffle of shoes against dirt. Silence. Closing in on the trees, he felt a shiver run down his back as the feeling of being watched washed over him again. He froze on the spot. Everything in him was telling him to just keep walking and not to stop until he was through his mother's kitchen door. But there was an even stronger urge to turn around, to look back one more time. The compulsion was too much to resist. He turned again to look at the lake. The man was still there, only now he was further in. The water was up to his shoulders now, and he was still smiling. Even from the distance of several yards in the dark, Grandfather somehow knew the man was still smiling. There was movement, and he saw the man lift his hand a third time, motioning for him to come back, to come closer, to come into the water. Grandfather wasn't sure of which, or even if it was any of those things, and he never found out. Without a word, he turned to face the trees and walked away. He walked the several miles home, unnerved and perplexed. And for the next 80 years, until his death at the age of 91, he never figured out who the man was, why he was there, or what he wanted. Over and over again he told us that story. The encounter clearly haunted him. It haunts me. I shudder to think what would have happened had my grandfather actually gotten close to that man, or lingered by the lake that night. But the one thing that has stuck out in my mind about his experience, more than anything, is that the man stood almost neck deep in water and didn't even make a ripple.
Number 2. Ever since my first stay at this luxury hotel, I'd heard stories of how people killed themselves, overdosed, slit their wrists. One guy even took a shotgun to the face. But none of that fazed me, since there were no ghost stories. Until one night, I came into work around 10:30 p.m. The girl I relieved from was out in the lobby, which was not unusual. I asked her, "What, you needed some lobby air?" And she just looked at me in horror. Well, once I got situated and ready to work, she explained to me that she kept hearing a little girl say "mummy" right behind her. I didn't take her too seriously though, as we all love to joke around and scare each other. Move forward a couple of hours. I was done with my work for the night, and I decided to lean back in my chair and close my eyes a little bit. I usually have music playing in the background, but today I didn't for some odd reason. The moment I closed my eyes, I heard it. I tried to make sense of it, but nothing in the office would make such a noise. I then put some music on and cranked up the volume. Now it's nearing the end of my shift, and my security guard comes into my office to finish up his paperwork in peace. Here we are, me sitting behind my table, and he sitting at our co-worker's table. We have complete silence when all of the sudden we both hear. We look at each other to verify that we had both heard what we just heard. He looks around and tries to find out where the noise could have come from. "It must have been my chair," he said. "But you didn't move," I said. "Well, it has to be the valet garage door opening," he said. "The door has been open all day," I reply. And then again. But this time, we just nope out of there. Later that night, I returned to work, and this time, I promised I would play music to muffle the noise. I did just that. But at one point in the night, me and the bellman had to go to the 4th floor storage area to grab a couple of items. We grab the items and leave the room. A couch which was standing upright and was just across the room falls over. We shut the lights and nope out of there. None of this stuff was scaring me as bad as the next scene. We are waiting for the service elevator to come down to the 4th floor. And as they open, what we saw will always haunt me. A little pink hairband in the corner of the elevator. Now it's getting out of hand. I took a couple of days off to keep my mind off it after this. A few months later, there was another incident at the gym. At this hotel, our gym is open 24 hours a day, but our pool closes at 11 PM. If you stay in the hotel, you will notice that the gym and pool are right next to each other and have windows from the gym facing the pool. Well, this hotel was just like that, except it's located on the 4th floor and also has a balcony. This is where shit really hit the fan. I get a call from the gym. It's a lady, and she has a sort of panic in her voice. I ask her if everything is alright, and if I should call the emergency personnel. She declines and informs me that there's a little girl in the pool area, but she's on the balcony and can't get her card to open the door. As soon as she said little girl, my world just froze in terror. She said that this little girl was watching her from the pool balcony through the windows, but she was not accompanied by any adult. This is when she tried to get the door open but couldn't. The only person in our hotel that can open that door was our engineer. I send our engineer up there. He opens the door, and there's no girl to be found. The lady in the gym was terrified, and I was scared shitless. And let's just say, I haven't been to that hotel since. Number 3.
This happened to me 4 years ago. It's by far the most extreme and life-threatening situation I've been in. I'm not saying this to evoke sympathy or pity. My story is a testament to the grim reality that creepy, demented, and twisted people exist in this world. The eyewitness account you are about to hear is 100% true. For some understanding, this happened in the United States. It was the summer of 2012. My longtime boyfriend and I had recently gotten married. Even though we were dirt poor college students and lived in a dinky apartment, we were having a blast. That particular summer, we gathered with our friends at the local movie theater almost every weekend. There was just one down the street from our apartment that had really cheap movie tickets. A night out that was under $10 was certainly within our budget. Anyway, one Thursday night, I received a call from this group of friends inviting us to watch the midnight premiere of the newest Batman movie. I had just finished working a 12-hour shift and was pretty tired. I almost refused the invitation and thought of crashing in my apartment instead. However, I didn't want to miss out on the fun, and it was a movie I'd wanted to see for a while anyways. Certainly, it wouldn't do any harm to stay up later than usual and miss a few hours of sleep, right? At 10:30 p.m., we met at the theater. We passed large cardboard cutouts of Catwoman and Batman as we walked inside, greeted by the smell of buttery popcorn and the chatter of excited moviegoers. The ticket booth was to the right of the entrance, and just above that was an electronic list of movies being played. The 12 a.m. showing of The Dark Knight Rises was displayed up there in bright red letters. Being paranoid that the tickets would sell out quickly, one of my friends swung by earlier that day and purchased tickets for all of us. We bypassed the ticket line and went straight to the ticket taker. She smiled at us and kindly directed us to Theater 9, which was on the right side of the lobby. If only I had known what I do now. That among the crowds, a killer was lurking. That as I walked across the tacky red and purple carpet towards Theater 9, I could have been walking to my death. I would have turned around in that instant and gone home. I would have never gone to see that movie at all. But, of course, I had no way of knowing what was about to happen. Oblivious to the peril I was putting myself in, I pushed open the doors for Theater 9 without giving it a second thought. The hallway in this theater was shaped like a U, and you could either go right or left. Theater 9 was the largest screening room in the building, perfect for accommodating the crowds that midnight premieres brought in. The screen was motionless and gray,
Not even the previews had started yet because there was still a good hour and a half to go until the movie actually started. We entered on the right side, so all of the seats were to our left. I remember being surprised at just how packed the theater already was. Just about every seat was filled, much to our dismay. At first it seemed like we wouldn't find a spot to sit together. Now, the way this theater was set up, there was a section of seats right in front of the screen. This area was flat, and there were about 5 rows of seating in this section. A lot of seats in this section were empty, but sitting right in front of the movie screen sucks, and none of us wanted to sit there. One of my friends then spotted a row with 5 empty seats, all next to each other, perfect for the amount of people we had. These seats were about 3 to 4 rows up from where the seating rows started to elevate. We ran up the stairs before someone could take the seats and filed in. My husband Brock sat on the 5th seat, I sat next to him, and my friend Samantha sat next to me on my right side. Her boyfriend, Tommy, sat next to her, and another friend named Leo sat in the aisle seat. We spent the next several minutes casually chatting, joking around, and laughing. After a while, my 3 friends went to the lobby to buy drinks and that addicting movie theater popcorn. While they were gone, Brock and I passed the time by people watching. The theater was bright since the lights weren't dimmed yet, and I could see everyone clearly. There were a lot of people dressed in Batman t-shirts and hoodies. One person even had a mask and one of those shirts with an attached cape. There were a lot of kids in attendance as well, which wasn't surprising because, even though it was a Thursday night, it was summer vacation, so that meant no school the next day. Of all the people I saw, the person I will never forget was the little girl sitting in our same row, a few chairs away. She was really cute, blonde with blue eyes, and passed us several times on her way to the lobby, each time coming back with various snacks and popcorn. Overall, people seemed very excited to see the movie, and the room was filled with energy and laughter. After what seemed like an eternity of waiting, the lights started to dim and the previews began. Just like every movie I've seen before, a quick animation flashed across the screen reminding us to get refreshments from the lobby. We were already devouring that popcorn like ravenous animals, to silence our cell phones, and to make sure we knew where the emergency exits were. The animation had this ugly CGI cat in a tuxedo that was sitting in a movie theater. I casually glanced at the bright green emergency exit signs that were on the left and right sides of the movie screen. I didn't think much of the reminder, like usual. After that, I only remember one preview for The Man of Steel. The others, I'm not so sure what they were about. When the movie started, the theater erupted into cheering and clapping. The title of the movie, The Dark Knight Rises, exploded onto the screen. This was followed by the scene where Bane is hijacking a plane. I thought this scene was pretty cool, and it caught my interest right away. Only when the movie started to get a little less interesting did I remember just how tired I was. I decided I could close my eyes at the more boring parts just to get a little bit of rest. I had been awake for 20 hours at that point, so I was rightfully sleepy. My eyes were closed for much of the duration of Batman and Catwoman's encounter. I don't really remember what was going on in that part of the movie. Perhaps some of you have seen it and know what I'm talking about. Anyway, when I opened my eyes again, Bruce Wayne was on his computer digging up information on Catwoman. This was the last scene I saw. I never got to watch the rest of the movie. All of a sudden, a loud bang erupted from the left side of the theater. I sort of screamed a little because it startled me. A strange smell started to fill the auditorium. It was like the smell of a firework, so I thought it was a cherry bomb or something similar. Had someone thrown fireworks into the crowd as a prank? Then, down near the right side of the movie screen, the dark silhouette of a person caught my attention. They were just a black frame against the bright movie screen. A series of flashing lights was coming from this person. It was a weird moment where time literally slowed down and everything went strangely quiet. I was completely frozen, unable to move, and really unable to think at all. It was like my brain had stopped working entirely. Brock caught on immediately to what was happening, and he grabbed me, pulled me to the ground, and laid on top of me, shielding me with his own body. At this point, time and sound returned to me. I could hear the gunshots ringing out across the theater. People were screaming. The movie was still playing on top of it all, creating a chaotic explosion of sound. I realized the flashing lights I had seen were bullets flying out of a gun barrel. An instant sensation of adrenaline flooded my body. There was absolutely nothing I could do except lay there and hope to God that the bullets I heard ripping through the seats and walls wouldn't go through me, too. At one point, shrapnel hit my head, cutting off a good chunk of my hair, and as I reached for the spot to make sure it wasn't bleeding, hot pieces of metal fell into my hand. I was lying face up so I could see everything that was happening. The lights from a still-playing movie danced across the ceiling and walls. My friends were on the floor with me. Our unfinished bucket of popcorn was spilled all across the floor. Leo had his legs sticking out into the aisle because there wasn't enough room for him to hide completely behind the seats. At some point, Samantha's water bottle, which had been in the cup holder between our seats, exploded. Water splashed all over my face. The smell of gun smoke was overwhelming. Riot-grade tear gas made me cry and caused me to cough uncontrollably. There was another smell, too. The horrible, metallic smell of blood that I'll never forget. I remember my lower body feeling wet all of a sudden. For some reason, I thought this came from the leaking water bottle, but I soon realized this wasn't the case. All of a sudden, things went strangely quiet. The bullets had stopped for some reason. Tommy shouted, "Let's get out of here!" We took advantage of the opportunity and made a run for it. We ran down the stairs, across the front of the screen towards the bright green exit sign. We crammed into a small, closet-like space where the door was. It was dark, so we had a hard time finding it. We were screaming and slamming on the walls to find the door, blinded by the tear gas and dumbfounded by shock. Then, finally, my hands felt the metal door handle, and I pushed against it with all my strength. The door flew open, and the light of a nearby streetlight flooded our eyes. We pushed against the door so hard that we all fell over onto the concrete. Samantha lost her pink flip-flops just outside this doorway. As I scrambled to my feet and literally ran for my life, I realized my legs were red, absolutely soaked with blood. It was like I dipped my legs into a bathtub full of it. I checked my body all over and realized I wasn't injured at all. Where had this blood come from? I looked behind me and realized that the blood was my husband's. He had been shot in the leg. A massive gaping hole had ripped through the lower half of Brock's right leg. His foot was barely hanging on and dangled lifelessly. Leo and a young man I didn't recognize were carrying Brock because, after falling outside the door, he lost all his strength and he couldn't walk. I was completely shocked. I had no idea he'd been injured, especially since he was right behind me the whole time and managed to escape the theater all by himself. How he did it on one foot, I'll never know. At this point, I screamed. My scream was so loud that it alerted nearby construction workers. At the back of the theater, there was a narrow parking lot, followed by a grassy lawn and then the street beyond that. The construction workers were doing road repair on this street, but as soon as they heard my scream and saw us running, they stopped working and watched what was going on. I'm not sure why this is such a vivid part of my memory. Anyway, they carried Brock along the back sidewalk all the way to the end where the corner of the building is. This was quite a distance, several dozen feet. My husband then collapsed from exhaustion and pain, saying he couldn't move anymore. He lay down and a puddle of blood started to form beneath him. I looked back and realized we had left a trail of blood leading from the door all the way to our current position. I was trembling. I knelt beside Brock and glanced around to see who else was injured. Tommy had been shot in the knee and the hip and was further away in the parking lot. The teenager who helped my husband was also injured. His dad and mom were with him. His mom was sitting against the wall and looked like she was going to pass out. She was bleeding from several places. That family escaped at the same time we did. I guess they heard the bullets stop and decided to make a run for it too. We were all lucky because the shooting was still going on inside. I had to take off my shirt and use it to stop the bleeding. I'll never forget how lifeless and limp his leg felt, and I imagine that's what a dead body must feel like. I got blood all over my hands and arms. The police showed up really fast. I'd say we were only outside for a minute or two before the red and blue sirens filled the night and rushed to our location. We were literally a block away from the police station. A female officer stood by us the whole time until paramedics arrived, which took a very long time. Brock was one of the last to be taken to a hospital. He was bleeding out for almost 20 minutes before an ambulance pulled up on the same street with the road work. At this point, he had become almost unresponsive and was on the verge of unconsciousness. Several massive guys rushed across the grass with a stretcher, loaded him onto it, and then ran with him back to the waiting ambulance. I wasn't able to go with him because there was another injured person in the ambulance, and it was too crowded. I wandered around to the front of the theater, alone, unsure of where my friends had gone. My blood-stained shirt and a pool of blood were left behind on the corner of that sidewalk. Walking through the crowds felt like a dream. I couldn't believe what had just happened. People were in hysterics and crying. A lot of people, such as me, were covered in blood, and like me, I'm pretty sure the blood staining their skin and clothes wasn't their own. A lot of people seemed to notice how lonely and dazed I looked, so they kept me company and even offered me a ride to different hospitals to find Brock, because I hadn't been told which hospital he was being taken to. I hung around these people for a while as the police swarmed the area and asked us what we saw inside the theater. The whole parking lot was on lockdown, and we weren't going to be allowed to leave any time soon. It was around 2 a.m., so it was very dark outside still, and I was pretty cold, wearing only an undershirt and shorts. The flashing red and blue lights of what seemed like 100 police cars were blinding. I remember seeing a big police vehicle pull up that said something like Crime Scene Investigation Unit on it. I think that's when it really sank in and hit me. I started to get sick to my stomach and wanted to vomit, but somehow I was able to hold it back. Eventually, police started letting people leave. I jumped into my truck and booked it out of there. I was going 90 to 100 miles per hour through red lights and residential areas without even slowing down. Stupid, I know, but I was desperate to learn the fates of Brock and Tommy. I was in such a panic that I didn't even think to go back to my apartment, grab my cell phone, which I had forgotten, and call my parents or someone else to help me. I was angry, upset, scared, and most of all, still in a state of shock. Was I really going to lose Brock only a month shy of our first wedding anniversary because of some psychopath with a gun? Thankfully, by the time dawn rolled around, I found the hospital he was treated in. This was in the next city over, maybe 45 minutes from the theater if you're going the speed limit. I was so happy to be there, and the hospital staff were also welcoming and understanding. After making sure I wasn't injured as well, they let me wait in the ICU room that Brock would be placed in when he was done recovering from surgery. I was so glad he was alive. Brock and Tommy both had survived, though many others weren't so lucky. I found out the following day, after some much-needed sleep on a hospital couch, that 12 people were killed in the shooting and over 70 were injured. I remember they first thought 15 people were killed, but the real number was 12. The little blonde girl sitting in my row did not survive. She died in the theater no more than a few feet from us. She'd been shot multiple times. A heartbroken police officer who cried during his court testimony tried unsuccessfully to save her by carrying her out of the theater and having her sent to a hospital. Tommy was rushed to a different hospital in the back of a police car. He underwent surgery and made a full recovery. The bullet missed his hip bone and narrowly missed his urinary tract and bladder. According to surgeons, my husband lost almost half of his blood. Brock made it to the hospital just in time. Any later, and he would have died. He underwent several blood transfusions and was in the hospital for 21 days. The wound to his leg was severe enough that they had to amputate it after trying unsuccessfully to save it. It's been so long since the shooting happened that my husband, friends, and I have been able to recover from it, somewhat. The event was pretty horrifying and has left us scarred for sure. I wouldn't consider that part of the story to be creepy, though. No. The creepy part is the shooter himself. I later learned much about him from the murder trial that would follow in the coming years. Though my encounter with this man was very brief, he has affected my life greatly. Just to know that people like this exist is disturbing. He is certainly one twisted individual that I never want to see again. I learned everything from watching the televised trial that took place in early 2015. This guy was going to school for neuroscience or something in California. I guess he was a pretty smart guy. However, for some reason, he had an obsession with killing people and had a stalker mentality. After dropping out of his university, he moved to my state and chose my local theater to commit a mass shooting. Before that, he was planning on hiding along remote hiking trails up in the mountains, jumping people, pulling them into the woods, and killing them there, though he never went through with that idea. He stalked my theater for months and had this shooting all planned out for the night of July 20th. Though I never saw him before this, it's unnerving to think this guy could have been watching us every time we went to the theater, and we would have never known it. We were completely unaware of what he had planned against us. This completely ruined my sense of security because who knows what the stranger next to you is planning on doing to you. I came very close to the shooter, but never actually saw his face in person until I was forced to testify in court. Of course, I saw his mugshots on television, but while in the theater, I only saw him as a dark silhouette in the shadows, like a demonic figure rendered from the darkest and most sinister nightmare. He was even in the hallway that we passed upon running for the emergency exit. The only thing stopping him from killing us there and then was his jammed assault rifle. To commit this crime, he ordered a few thousand rounds of ammunition, riot gear, and armor, tear gas, an assault rifle, and a shotgun. He took pictures of himself, which were shown in court, wearing all of this gear like some sick trophy and holding up these weapons with a menacing smile. He dyed his hair orange and put in these creepy black contacts while making devilish faces into the camera, something that made me sick just looking at it. Before driving to the theater with all of his gear in his car, he booby-trapped his entire apartment and set it to explode if anyone opened the door. Then, once at the theater, he posed as a moviegoer and even bought a ticket for the movie. I think his ticket had Theater 8 on it, which was next door, but Theater 9 had more people in it, so he went into number 9 instead. He was in the few front rows. I must have passed him several times in the lobby while he was there. Maybe he had seen me, too. At some point during the movie, he got up and went through the side exit, which didn't have an alarm for some reason, kept it propped open with something, then went to his car to put on all of his armor and grabbed his weapons. Then he came back inside and started shooting. When we escaped the theater, we ran past his white car which was parked right at the exit. We didn't even notice it. At some point, he came outside and he would have seen us there on the concrete. I don't know what stopped him from shooting people that were outside too, but he could have easily ended us there and then if he'd wanted to. I think the hardest part for me was facing this twisted individual in court. I'll never forget rising as they called my name, walking down the center row past my family, other survivors, and crowds of news-hungry media personnel. I sat right across from him, maybe only 10 feet away. While his orange hair was gone and he wasn't wearing black contacts, being so close to him was creepy and an uncomfortable experience. My encounters with this man are certainly ones I will never forget. I can now say that I've come face to face with a true, deranged psychopath. He just had this blank stare in his eyes the whole time. If eyes truly are windows to the soul, then his soul was filled with nothing but a cold indifference for those he had murdered and harmed. He wouldn't even look at me. Sitting across from him in court was the second time I had knowingly been in the same room with this man, a man who had tried to take my life, but thankfully failed. a man who would end up spending forever behind bars when, at the end of it all, he was sentenced to 3,318 years in prison for his crimes. This is to the man who tried to kill me. The man who has caused countless nightmares and fueled the fires of my paranoia. The man who hurt my friends and family, caused years of untold grief for my husband because he will never walk the same again. The man who stole the innocence and joy from a 6-year-old child who went into that theater alive and came out dead. To the man who carried out the worst mass shooting in Colorado history, let's not meet again, ever. I hope you rot in prison.
Number 4. I used to work in a hotel in Southern California, doing security. Every night we would get a printout of which rooms were vacant. It was my job to go through all the rooms and ensure that all the lights were off and that the windows were secure. I went into a room and found the light on. I started turning the lights off from the left side of the room to right, around the windows and up to the bathroom. The bathroom has French-style doors that open towards the room. The doors themselves only have hinges and 2 handles to pull on them. No other devices attached. The doors are also made of a very light wood. Anyway, I opened the left door out all the way so that I could reach around it and turn the light off in the bathroom. After turning the light off, I realized it was freezing in the room, which is not uncommon being housekeeping liked it cold when they worked on a room. I reached up for the thermostat, and when my hand was within 4 inches of the door, the bathroom door which I had just opened slammed shut by itself. Terrified, I ran out of the room immediately. Whilst I was pulling the door shut behind me, the deadbolt pushed itself out the door and slammed into the door frame. I was petrified when I had to reach inside the door to disengage it. I stood there for a minute or two with my eyes watering, wondering what had just happened. I decided to go back in and look to just be sure of what happened. I went in and looked at the door. It was shut. I moved it around to see if it would close on its own, which it wouldn't. I tried throwing the door to slam it, and the door is so lightweight it caught a lot of air and wouldn't even shut all the way after throwing it closed. As far as I could see, there wasn't an explanation for what happened, and I stopped going into that room. Number 5.
My uncle just got married. For their honeymoon, he, his new wife, and her daughter went to stay in a cabin on Big Bear Mountain in Southern California. They arrived, unpacked their luggage, and settled in for a 3-day stay. On the last night, my uncle was up watching TV very late by himself, his wife and stepdaughter having already gone to bed. Needing to use the restroom, he got up, did his business, then exited the room. The only light on in the whole cabin is that from the TV in the living room, but it was bright enough to light the whole living room and part of the hallway. As he opened the door to the restroom, he saw his wife walk down towards the kitchen. He figured that she had got up because she was hungry, so went to go and talk with her. He followed after her, but when she reached the end of the hallway, she turned slightly in the direction of the kitchen, before running at full speed into the room. She was fast, in fact, faster than any human should be. At this point, my uncle doubted what he was seeing. This figure was wearing a long, flowing white gown, similar to the one his wife had worn to bed, and she had the same, slightly longer than shoulder-length hair. But this figure wasn't his wife. He took a few steps back and peeked into the room where his wife and stepdaughter were supposed to be asleep. They were both there in bed, asleep. Needless to say, he couldn't sleep after that. When they left the next morning, my uncle called the guy who he had rented the cabin from and said, "Hey, you didn't tell me this cabin was haunted." To his surprise, the guy replied, "Oh, you saw her?" "Her." He said her. My uncle hadn't specified what he had seen. That means that he had not been the only one to have seen the speedster she-ghost that was haunting that cabin.
Number 6. I was abroad in Ukraine, and I was the only student from my school that attended this particular program. So I was lonely and stressed out most of the time, looking for friends. This one local guy spoke English pretty well, and he was about my age, and went to the same local university. He was an okay person. I didn't get major creeper vibes at first, so we ended up hanging out a lot. Tuesdays and Thursdays, we would always go to the same bar together and listen to the live music. One Tuesday, however, I wasn't feeling very well at all, and I texted him saying that I was going to be staying home. Next Thursday, whilst we're walking to the bar, he starts talking about how disappointed he was that I had bailed, but he wasn't angry because I really did look very sick. This was an alarming comment, because there was no way that he could have seen me that day. I never left the apartment. I asked him how it was that he knew that I looked really sick, and then he pulled out his phone, and on it there was a picture of me, taken from outside my bedroom window. I live in an old Soviet apartment block. My apartment was 7 stories up. He must have had a camera with some great zoom, and must have camped out in one of the neighbouring buildings, just waiting for me. He offered no explanation for the photo, and instead started talking about how if I bailed on him again, he would actually get angry this time, and that I wouldn't like him when he's angry. After that pirated line, I wanted out, but I had a feeling that if I left, I would be in for a really bad time. So I played along with it for the rest of the night, even when he started to get grabby and possessive, even when he started making disgusting sexual remarks about me. I made it home safely, locked and covered everything, and told my host Babushka and Dedushka what happened. Dedushka was an officer in the Soviet Air Force and heavily involved with the mob after the fall. He did something to take care of the problem. I don't know what, but it worked. Number 7.
First, I will give some background on me, as to establish some basic human credibility before I recount the events that have caused me immense anxiety and depression. I am now a 21-year-old student at Long Beach State, looking to graduate in political science this coming spring. I'm also an alumni member of a sorority on campus. I don't usually do drugs, but during the course of these events, I used marijuana once. In mid-January 2011, my best friend Athena and I looked to move out of the sorority house in hopes of bringing some form of normalcy back to our lives. We found an apartment for rent in our price range, $1,200 for a 2-bedroom in downtown Long Beach, so we followed up and made it happen. The day after we moved in, something strange happened. I went to take my second shower since moving in, and 5 minutes into it was greeted by my neighbour from downstairs, complaining that massive amounts of water were leaking into her unit from ours. I checked the water heater and found water gushing from an emergency release valve on top, which is never supposed to be opened. A few weeks later, towards the end of February, I had come home from my pitiful job at a bookstore to find my roommate locked out on our second-story balcony. She knocked on the glass door and I let her in. Thinking it hilarious, I asked her how long she had been locked out for. It turned out she had been there for 6 hours. And because her right arm was in a splint from shoulder surgery, she hadn't been able to climb down from the balcony. She had left her phone inside as she had slipped out for a cigarette. We agreed it was kind of strange, but laughed about her being stuck out there for 6 hours. A few days later, Athena offered me some marijuana to celebrate our new lives away from the sorority house. I decided it would be fun. I went to bed 45 minutes later, and out of nowhere I was the most terrified I have ever been in my life. I felt a strange sensation, and I had the overwhelming feeling that there was some manifestation of negative energy in my room. I could hear thoughts that were not mine, and they were not pleasant. Strangely, my closed door was slamming back and forth against the frame, so I closed my windows. However, it continued. Frantically, I grabbed my phone from the windowsill so as to text Athena in the next room. My phone showed one new text, yet when I clicked the message box, there was no message. Already freaked out, this unnerved me even more. Athena told me that I needed to calm down and go to bed, so I did. The next morning when I woke up, I was convinced that last night's experiences were the result of the drugs. I brushed the bad memories aside. A few weeks went by without event. Then, one day whilst I was at work, I received a text from Athena saying that she was locked out on the balcony again. So I left work early to go home and let her in. Yet this time was different. When I got home and let her in, she was freaked out. She told me that this time she had left the door open a few inches, but inexplicably, it had slammed shut on its own and latched right after. Not only was this a heavy glass door, but to activate the lock, it has to be pushed up. The weeks and months that followed were amongst the worst of my life. Any peace of mind that I had in my own bedroom was lost. When I wanted to fall asleep, strange things would start happening. My closed door would shake back and forth, and occasionally I would hear a violent bang against it. In fact, it reached the point where I would put my shoes up against the door to stop it from banging back and forth, only to find one of those shoes flung across the other side of the room by the next morning. Athena would go home to San Diego on the weekends, which meant that I was often in the apartment alone. It was then that these experiences were all the more intense. Footsteps on the carpet next to me, an overwhelming negative energy, goosebumps out of nowhere. It was a very strange sensation, and I'm afraid I cannot quite effectively describe it. My sleeping habits deteriorated, and my grades began to drop like stones. The two of us just didn't know how to deal with it, so we started to ignore it. But I can tell you that it was very difficult to ignore. On a daily basis, I would stay awake until at least 2 a.m. Falling asleep before then, regardless of how tired I was an impossibility. Something would always keep me up. Some nights I would even hear a growling sound. It was low-pitched and chilled me to the bone. To begin with, I thought it was an aeroplane, but after going outside and not being able to hear the sound, I concluded that the source was indeed inside the apartment. Matters continued to escalate. During the day in mid-April, Athena's girlfriend, Kadisha, came over. We were setting up a movie when the power went out, yet to our surprise, the power outage was restricted to our 2 bedrooms and not to the rest of the apartment. So we decided to play Uno on the carpet in the main room. While playing, all 3 of us heard the sound of something sliding across the tile countertop in the kitchen. I went to investigate and found that a bottle of champagne was rolling by itself. I picked it up and placed it upright on the counter. But as soon as I turned my back and started walking away, I heard the sound of glass shattering. I spun around, and the very same bottle I had just placed on the counter had been knocked over and had shattered. Words cannot express how scared it made me, as there was nothing that could have possibly caused it to break. We were so spooked that we stayed at Kadisha's that night. The next day after my classes, I went home and discovered Athena's room had been completely torn apart. It looked like the place had been ransacked. There were clothes everywhere, items scattered. Her heavy wooden desk had been completely knocked over, and the pencil tray had been pulled out all the way and dumped all over the floor. It looked like a tornado had whisked through the room. Then, all of a sudden, I looked through the glass door and saw Athena locked out on the balcony. Immediately she started pounding on the glass. "Let me in! Hurry up! Let me the hell in!" I ran to open the door for her, and the first thing she said to me was this: "All of this happened while I was out there. I watched some invisible force tear my room apart." We were both terrified, shaking, wanting nothing more than to get out of there and never go back. It was at this point that we decided to leave and spend the night at the sorority house. We broke our lease, and after packing our things we never returned. Although the activity in the house never escalated to the point where we got physically hurt, the never-ceasing assault from whatever unseen presence was clearly in that apartment would not give us peace. We could no longer handle it, and were not prepared to wait and see what would happen next.
Number 8. The story I'm about to relate to you happened 4 years ago. It was afternoon and I was home alone. From where I sat in my bed, I could see the brightness of the sun pour in through the window. And all of a sudden, my relaxation was interrupted by a faint whisper in my ear. It was that of a little girl, and I'll never forget what she said to me. "Get out of it." As soft as her voice was, her words chilled me to the bone. I was terrified. Later that day, long after the sun had set and night rolled in, I heard someone running up and down the hallway right outside my bedroom door. But no one was there. The footsteps were light and made me think of the child's whisper from earlier that day. The events marked the beginning of a series of paranormal experiences which I cannot explain. A few weeks passed without incident. Then once again I was sitting home alone in my bed and my eyelids felt heavy. So I closed them, just for a second. And you know when you close your eyes you can see things without actually seeing? Well, in that moment between the blackness and the light, I saw a little girl. She was standing just a few feet away from me, in the corner of the room. She was young, short, and wore a red dress which was embroidered with a leaf pattern. Her skin was extremely pale, almost translucent. Her hair, parted down the middle, was long and black. I only saw her for that split second, but the image of her imprinted itself into my mind. For several months afterwards, I would see this girl in my dreams each night. The sight of her haunted me, following me from dream to dream. During this time, objects would mysteriously disappear, only to reappear in a different place. All the time, I felt as though this child wanted something from me, yet I did not know how to help her. Then one night, the girl visited me no more. She was gone from my dreams and my house, and so the spectral girl exited my life as mysteriously as she had entered it. In the aftermath of my experience, I tried using a Ouija board in an attempt to contact the spirit child. It provided no answer. Since that time, I have not heard or seen the girl again. I will never know what she wanted from me, or whether or not her spirit found peace. Number 9.
Let's say I was glad that one day of training was all I needed to say that I didn't want to work at this particular hotel. I used to work in the hotel industry, but had left the profession for a year due to my course at university getting quite difficult for a couple of semesters. I came back into it looking to do some part-time work manning the front desk on Friday and Saturday nights. The particular hotel I applied to work at was built so that there was a car park level directly above the reception and main entrance area. Guests could only access it after calling the front desk, and you would have to manually walk through the car park to open the gated entrance. Nobody else had access to it, only people at the front desk. I was going through the whole on-the-job training thing when the receptionist who was training me told me some stories about the hotel, including all of the suicides they've had. On his watch alone, 3 people had jumped or fallen from the balcony and landed in the car park area. I will never forget how he described the noise of them hitting the car park. He said it sounded like a bomb had gone off, and the whole reception area would shake for a couple of seconds. He then told me about the incidents of staff, especially porters, seeing shadows and people in their rearview mirror when moving the cars around to make room for other cars. There was one story where someone who had newly started working at the hotel was called on by a guest to grab something out of the car. He had only gone up to the car park level for a couple of minutes when housekeeping staff heard screaming coming from that level. The new member of staff ran down the stairwell, frantically opening the door into the main foyer. Luckily, there weren't any guests checking in at that very moment, as he collapsed on the floor, screaming that he had saw someone walk up to the car and peer into the window while he was searching for whatever it was the guest had asked him to grab.
Number 10. This happened to me when I was around 6 or 7. I am a twin, and my sister and I shared a room at the time. Our beds were pushed against adjacent walls, and their heads met at the corner. On the opposite corner was a closet. Between our beds and the closet, there was a huge amount of open floor space where we could play. We had a close family friend called Nana. She wasn't related to us by blood, but she was practically a grandmother to us, and we loved her dearly. She was an older woman who was very religious and one of the kindest people I've ever known. That night, I can't remember why, but Nana was staying overnight with us. We had set up an air mattress in my sister and I's room for her to use. My bed was parallel to the mattress, with the foot of the bed facing the closet. So Nana and I had the same view of the closet. Very late that night, I woke up for no particular reason. I remember knowing that it must have been late, because the TV was off downstairs. My parents often stayed up late watching it, so it must have been at least past midnight. Nana and my sister were both fast asleep, and I could hear my dad snoring in the other room. I was the only one awake. The first thing I noticed was the closet door. It was open. This was unusual, as we always closed it to stop our cat from going in there and messing with our things. The second thing that I noticed was that the interior was pitch black. It wasn't a normal kind of darkness. There was a street lamp right outside that room, which gave off enough excess light for you to be able to see inside the closet. But not today. It was total darkness, almost like the blackness itself was absorbing the light, absorbing it entirely. At the same time, there seemed to be a shape inside the closet. It's hard to describe what it was like, as it didn't seem to interact with the light like a normal object. However, I do remember that it took up the whole space of the closet, and that it looked sharp. In fact, I remember specifically thinking it looked like broken glass. But even that's not exactly the right way to describe this thing. Everything about this object, this thing, seemed wrong, unplaceable, unnatural, and even sinister. Being a terrified child, I sat there for a long time unable to move. Then, very quietly, I woke up my Nana. She needed glasses, so I don't know how she could have seen this thing, because she seemed very calm. And when I told her what I saw, she asked me if I thought it was real or not. I honestly didn't know, and when I said as much, she told me to do the unthinkable. Go touch it. I could understand her thinking. She probably thought if I got close I could see that it was just a dress or a coat, and that I would no longer be afraid. But I just could not bring myself to do it. I was frozen. It felt as if hours had passed, and eventually I slid off my bed, Nana still laying down without her glasses on. The thing did not move as I got closer, and it didn't go away either. I was terrified of touching it, not only because of how dark and evil it felt, but also because I was certain that I would be cut to ribbons. It towered over me, as real as anything, and slowly, shaking, I stuck my hand into the closet. My hand went right through the thing, no change in temperature or in the way that the air felt, and no reaction from the creature itself. Petrified, I managed to whimper, "It's still there, Nana." I was holding back tears. I didn't see or hear her move to turn the lights back on, but the instant that they were on, I was standing in front of the empty closet. Nana looked just as scared as I did, and made me promise not to tell my sister, who was still sound asleep. I still don't know what that darkness was, but I never saw it again.
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I would like to extend a huge thank you to my good friends Cayleigh Elise and the Paranormal Scholar for joining me in this video. If you missed yesterday's dark video, be sure to check it out by clicking the link on screen now. I know you'll all enjoy it. Also, please remember to smash that like button and subscribe, as you won't want to miss what I have in store for you next. And remember that if you have had a creepy or paranormal experience that you wish to share, feel free to send it to my email, which you can find in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter @TheMortisMedia for some secret stuff you won't find anywhere else. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.